All right, folks. Well, it's kind of bittersweet for me today's podcast because number one, I'm extremely delighted to host an amazing investigative journalist, Emily Le Coz, who is going to give us a lot of her time today on the Healthcare Unfiltered podcast. And as some of you know, I've always wanted to be a journalist. I was just never smart enough to be one. But the reason it's bitter is because it's about a topic that is depressing and that is alarming, but it is our job to really shed some light on it about burnout in the workplace and the tragedy that could actually lead to it. Emily, welcome to the Healthcare Unfiltered. I'm beyond thrilled that you are with me on today's show.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
So, how did you end up becoming a journalist? How did this all come about?
In college, I was hesitating between a major in biology and journalism. I was really fascinated by science. I was pretty good at it. And so I asked my dad for advice, and he said that he always pictured me as a journalist, as doing more creative writing. And I was always very interested in creative outlets as a child. And so he said, if you go into journalism, you can write about science. And so I went in that direction. I got a job at the college newspaper, starting on the copy desk, doing editing, and then working my way to being a reporter. And I just fell in love with it. The camaraderie, the excitement in the newsroom. This was in the 90s. So, just at the beginning of internet, and newspapers were still thriving. And so it was just a great time to be in that profession. And I realized pretty quickly that my stories could make an impact. One of the first stories that I did was about protests on my college campus, urging the University of Minnesota, where I went to school, to divest in its stocks connected to Burma. And the university did ultimately decided to divest in its stocks after my coverage of the protests. And so I was sort of hooked at that point. Like, wow, I've got an opportunity to make a positive impact on my community by just bearing witness to things that were happening. And so I never looked back.
Yeah, when you see that a story leads to outcome, that really gives you this, more motivation to keep going. When did you start with USA Today?
I started here about 4 years ago. I was with another media company that merged with Gannett, which owns USA Today. And as we merged, my team and me, we all sort of got folded into the USA Today investigations team. And so I've been doing work for USA Today since late 2019.
Mm-hmm. And then there's every magazine or journal, they have an online outlet and a print outlet. Are they completely different? Like your stories appear only online, only on print? Are they completely separate entities, or they appear on both platforms?
Yeah, that's a really good question. We consider ourselves a digital first media company. So everything that we write is, primarily first and foremost goes online. And then we have print editors who look at all of the online stories that have been written and determine which of those stories then go into the print product. And so some of my stories do, many of my stories do end up in the print product, but not all of them. And then the print product has space limitations. So, if I write a 5,000 word story, it's no problem to put that whole thing online. But, most of our print products, our print stories are capped at about 3,000 words. So like for this latest story that I did, I had to go in and edit out, strip, about
Right.
1,000 words out in order for it to fit.
I have to tell you, Emily, so one of the things that I've tweeted about and I've been a little bit vocal about over the past couple of years is a little bit, I feel like journalism as much as I admire the profession, I've always honestly wanted to be one. Maybe that's why I podcast. But I feel it's very difficult um, not to be biased and politicized. Like I've always felt as a journalist, you need to provide facts, do investigation, you do reporting, and let readers or viewers decide. Every so often you could add some flavor of your views and so on, but then it becomes a little bit biased. How do you maintain, as a journalist, how do you maintain this separation? You could have your own political views, social views, whatever they are. But as a journalist, you need to get this out of the mind so you could report on things. How difficult it is? How can you keep it going?
Yeah, I think for me, it's relatively easy. It not because I like possess any sort of like great ability to detach myself, but because I'm fascinated with learning as much about everybody and everything. And so I will give you an example. I used to cover politics as a reporter in Mississippi, and I would cover candidates whose platforms I really disagreed with. For example, there was a candidate, this was back in probably 2007, 2008, who was very much in favor of the Old Testament, right? Very biblical, traditionalist reading. Women should not be in the workforce. And I'll put it right out there. Like, I disagree with that. I'm a woman in the workforce. I would like to keep my job and not go back to the Old Testament. But when I cover his campaign events and I interview him, I'm genuinely fascinated by what this man is saying. And I want to accurately write everything that I can and put it out there in an uncritical, unbiased way so that for no other reason than there's accurate documentation of this person at this time in this place, so that should anybody have questions 100 years in the future, they can go back and read my story and know exactly what this man stands for. And I've got no problem putting that out because I want people to know exactly who he is, if that makes sense. And
Yes.
and so I feel that way no matter what I cover. I'm more interested in just learning, absorbing information, and presenting it without my opinion, because my overriding opinion is that there should be a factual account.
Have you seen changes though? I mean, you've been reporting for a while. I mean, obviously in college, but as you went into like USA Today and other outlets, have you noticed changes when you look at other people, other journalists, and have you noticed there's a little bit more of the biased? Um, are you able to separate, I guess, signal from noise when it comes to reading an article, and you can really palpate the bias because you can sniff that, right? I mean, you're in the profession.
And for me, so I've worked in traditional media my entire career. So newspapers, basically. And newspapers are all, pretty traditional at their heart, right? Like most newspapers were established decades ago, if not, a century or more ago. And so, I do see a difference in terms of there's a lot more online media, online only media. I think of like BuzzFeed and the Huffington Post and Politico, right? Like these sort of newer media outlets that are sort of edgier, and they go after a younger audience, an audience that is used to having a plethora of options available to them for where they get their news, versus the outlets that I've worked for my entire career used to be the only place to get your news.
Mhm.
And that was the case for so long. Wherever you grew up, that was the newspaper that you had. That was the only place for you to get news about your town. And of course, then those newspapers would have a page or two where they'd pick up new national or international news, usually from the Associated Press or Reuters. And so I feel like there was this sort of homogeny and a very agreed upon narrative that all Americans sort of had, because they just didn't really have any other place to get their news.
Right.
And so what I have seen is not so much a bias from within or a change from within the industry so much as a huge change on the outside of the industry, where now people have a choice and they're hearing different opinions and people who are presenting news as though it's fact, but it's actually very much opinion based.
Right.
And now they're pointing at us and saying, fake news or you're biased. And I really don't think, from what I've seen, and I've been doing this almost 30 years, my colleagues and I haven't changed. The public has.
Mm-hmm.
And some of my colleagues, like I said, Huffington Post and the like, have adapted to that change and are trying to capture certain audiences. But sort of traditional journalists, we've always been this way, and you can call it liberal if you like, but I think at our core, journalists we have two pretty central missions. One is documenting history as it happens, and that just requires accuracy, not bias. Just I am a mirror and I'm reflecting back what I see. And the second is our mission is for the common man, woman, people.
Right.
We are very much interested in community, in what benefits everybody. And so when I hear people say, journalists traditionally are very liberal, I sort of chafe at that because it sounds political, and it's not. It's we're community based. We care for the common man, and that seems to be the antithesis of a certain capitalistic, right-leaning ideal. And so I don't. Yeah, I understand the criticism, but I think it's coming from
It's probably overblown out of proportion.
Yeah, I don't think it's political.
Yeah.
You don't see a lot of journalists getting into the business because we really care about
Right.
the billionaires.
Agreed. How do you get your stories? I mean, I guess the question is really twofold. Number one is, how often do you need to find a story to cover, and how do you get those? And number two, how do you decide to cover a story? Let's say I call you, email you, whatever. What the process that you go through until you say, you know what, this is a story I'm going to cover. I'm going to spend some time investigating and interviewing and learning about, versus, okay, it's a good story, but probably not for me. Is there a process in your mind to make a decision of a story that you cover? Because from there, I want to go into this emotional story that I read for you, that you wrote, which led to our conversation. But how do you decide whether something is worth coverage or not?
Right. So it depends. I'll just first briefly mention, if early in my career when I was a beat reporter, I had certain beats. You cover local business or you cover local politics, and that there's more to do. I was writing 2 or 3 stories a day, and it's pretty easy to decide what to cover. You go to all the city council meetings, you go to the transportation commission meetings, right? You are just really writing about things that are happening every day. In investigations, it takes a lot longer to produce those types of stories. It sometimes can be weeks, months, maybe even a year or more. And so we really have to choose those stories carefully, because that's an enormous investment of time and resources. And to do a story that, like, you really have to make sure it's going to benefit a lot of people, or have interest, a wide appeal, or make some really significant contribution or change. And so we get tips a lot as part of the investigations team. My colleagues and myself, we receive a lot of email tips, a lot of telephone tips, sometimes from people we've never talked to, or sometimes from sources who we've just kept in contact with are tipping us off to something we might want to look into. 9 times out of 10, those tips don't result in anything. We'll look at them all, but either it's something that there's no way to prove it, or it's something that might be interesting but not really relevant to a broader group of people, right? Like, so for some reason, I get an inordinate amount of tips about homeowners associations that are really unfair. And those are probably great stories. I'm sure everybody in that subdivision would read the story, but it just doesn't have a wide enough appeal to the general public, whether the president of your homeowners association in Fairbanks, Alaska, or wherever is,
But Emily,
not
are you now focused on healthcare as a sector in terms of your reporting? Is this like, or not necessarily?
so not necessarily, but I'm really interested in it as of late, and I'm continuing to dig into it. I have written previously about healthcare in the past. So this, my investigation into retail pharmacy, although that's the first investigation into retail pharmacy I've done, I've definitely done other healthcare related stories, but I've done investigations on, criminal justice. Um,
Well,
um,
this was big. I came across your article and the story of Ashleigh Anderson, and we're linking this to the podcast notes. But there's a lot here to talk about. But maybe I'll start by, how did you first learn about the story? A tip, just Twitter, social. How did you learn about it?
Oh, well, I was interviewing pharmacists for an investigation that I was working on, that resulted in a story I published in October. Several of them had mentioned Ashleigh Anderson. When we were talking about stress and burnout and the impact that it has to individual retail pharmacists, several of
So
them have.
not to interrupt, but what made you decide to dig into burnout and retail pharmacy that led to the story in October 23?
That was a tip, actually, that I got from a source who I'd written about back in 2019 for something completely unrelated. She had called and said, I don't know if you might be interested, but I went to CVS to pick up a prescription for our son, and the prescription was wrong, and we had to rush him to the hospital. And it was one of the families who I profiled in that story. And she said, it's nuts. I don't know if this is happening to other people, but if you're interested, maybe looking into pharmacy errors. And about a week later, a colleague of mine had a tip come in via email from another family that had a medication error. And so it was those two back-to-back tips from totally unrelated people in different parts of the country that made me think, okay, this might be a story. And so my initial thought was, I'm probably going to find some evidence of pharmacists just being careless. And this is a story where in my mind, I'm already seeing the victims are, families and patients, and the villains, if you will, are the pharmacists. But what I learned very quickly in talking to pharmacists was that the pharmacists themselves were victims, and victims of a corporate culture that has stripped them of resources and saddled them with tasks and imposed upon them these metrics that really force them to work in ways that they feel are unsafe and heighten the risk of those errors that initially got me interested in this topic.
And when you got that tip, which led to the article in October 2023, which I also read and would link to that, but how did you start? And did people talk to you freely? Were they afraid of telling you, like, and how do you just pick up the phone and call random people and say, hey, do you talk to me? And then you've got so many retail pharmacies. You've got Walgreens, CVS, Walmart, Target, like everywhere they have some, Jewel, Asco. How much, do you go to all of them? Like, what's the process, I guess, because you want to get to the truth, right? Your goal is to get to the truth. I presume you've spent a lot of time to get the actual facts.
Yeah, I didn't really know any retail pharmacists. So I went to LinkedIn and just started messaging random pharmacists. And several of them didn't respond, or just, responded once and then quickly ran away from me. And it took me a while until I found someone who was willing to talk to me. And that person led to the next person. And pretty soon I started building up more of a source list. And as I was talking to people, they would recommend other people. And then there were a few key pharmacists who were really instrumental and helped connect me with just a bunch of other people. And once that started happening, then more and more people felt comfortable talking to me. But the start of any investigation, especially into something that you've not previously written about, is very daunting because you don't know anybody and you don't know anything, and you're just cold calling people and hoping that they'll give you the time of day. And it
What
takes
did
a
you
long
find
time.
out? Yeah, what
What's that?
what did you find out back then before you learned about Ashleigh? You were investigating the larger picture. What did you find out?
Well, what I found out was that pharmacists were acknowledging that there were errors and telling me that there are more errors than there ever have been. But it's not because pharmacists are somehow careless or lazy, that they really felt as though they were being pressured to work under conditions that created scenarios in which errors are just more likely to happen. For example, being in a pharmacy by themselves, having to fill 500 prescriptions a day, and having computer monitors that are turning red if you're not filling them within a certain amount of time. Red is bad because then it means your store's metrics are dropping. If your store's metrics are dropping, you will be contacted by your boss. You will be coached and counseled, disciplined, possibly moved to a less desirable location or terminated. I mean, there are real life consequences to not doing exactly what these companies want you to do. And they know if I'm going to fill these prescriptions safely and really verify, do I have the right drug for the right person at the right dose? Are there any contraindications that might appear based on other medications this person is taking or what I have in their profile, right? Like that requires a lot of focus and diligence. And yet they don't feel like they can give their attention to doing this job safely because they've got to whip through these prescriptions super fast while answering the phone within 60 seconds of it starting to ring, or that other metric will start going down, while answering questions, while handling the drive through, right? Like there's so many things that are happening all at the same time. And they feel like if they do any of it well, all the metrics are sliding and they could lose their job. So it boils down to a choice. Am I going to keep my job and practice unsafely, or am I going to practice safely and risk losing my job? And for many retail pharmacists working at these chains, that's exactly what it comes down to. And it wasn't one or two people who told me this. I interviewed like 50 different pharmacists from all across the country, from different chains, as well as reviewed emails that I had received from over 100 other pharmacists. It was very consistent across the board. I was very comfortable with the fact that this wasn't, a few people just struggling, that this was very much an across the board experience that was being faced by pharmacists.
You know, in your first story from 2023, you linked to an audio, which is like 20 or 30-second audio of one of the managers in CVS, I believe, who was literally almost like yelling to at the pharmacist about certain metrics, and he actually used profanity as well. Like it was just, I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Like I mean, when you saw that, I mean, this must have been shocking to you as a journalist when you learned about all of these things.
Yeah, I listened to 5 hours worth of meetings that man conducted, and it was very threatening. They were being threatened. Basically, if you're not hitting these targets, we're not going to approve more pharmacy tech hours. So basically, you're going to have even fewer staff available to you if you're not able to hit these targets. And these targets were not the type of thing that I think would benefit the general public. Some of it was vaccinations, but some of it was just pushing, store membership cards. It really had nothing to
Well, I
do
mean,
with.
the one I listened to, Emily, was like the flu shots. Like, I
Yeah.
don't care about, I don't care. I mean, you just gotta do the flu shots.
Yes.
I mean,
Yeah.
Did you call like Walgreens and CVS like these, like did you call leadership and were they willing to talk to him like, hey guys, I mean I have like tape I have
Yeah.
in front of me. Did you call them and did they what happened there if you did?
Yeah, I did. Well, so that tape was CVS, and I did speak to CVS and told them what I had heard and asked, you know, for their comment on that. And I think basically what they said was that that is not, the way that they do business. That certainly pharmacists should not be threatened, and that you know as to the quota on the number of flu shots that they, I think they were trying to distance themselves from trying to hit any hard numbers, and that these metrics are just based on volume that the store had done the previous year, and sort of couched it in very corporate terms, if you will.
Yeah. And this man is still employed?
As far as I know.
I mean,
Yeah.
that's, I mean, it's hard. It's just, I mean, it's terrible, honestly. I hope somebody from CBS is listening to this podcast. What, then you learned about Ashleigh Anderson as you were doing that investigation. How did this come about? People just mentioned her name or something?
Yeah, several people mentioned her name. And I did look into trying to contact her family at the time I was working on that other story, but they have a very common last name, Anderson, and I didn't know, exactly how to reach out to her parents. And I just thought, this sounds like a separate story. If I am able to contact them, I don't think that belongs in this story. I think that would be a separate story altogether. So I just tucked that in the back of my mind. And then once that story was published in October, um, I was able to connect with her family and start the interview process with them. Yeah.
So the Ashleigh Anderson story is just shocking. I mean, this is a young woman who was going really through the ladder. Something happened where she decided not to keep pursuing advancement in career, which was not clear from your story what happened, but something happened. And she decided just, I don't want to just be a retail pharmacist and that's it. With nothing is wrong with that, but she was probably having aspirations to do something different, I believe, from reading between the lines. Um, and then she just dies because she wouldn't go to the hospital.
Yeah.
Can you take us through, like, how did you go through the process to know what's going on, what information you captured? I mean, how difficult was to do this story?
Um, it was difficult. Anytime you're writing a story about somebody who dies or who something terrible happens to them and you're interviewing their family members, it's incredibly hard because you just feel empathy for them and you're asking them to please reopen this wound and be very vulnerable with somebody they've never met before. I've never met them. I've still never met them in person. I'm just this voice on the other end of a cell phone call asking them to be incredibly vulnerable and take me back to probably the worst time of their life. So for me, that's the most difficult part is earning their trust and doing it in a way that's respectful and hopefully serving the greater good.
I
Um,
mean, I was reading and I knew what the outcome is going to be, and I was hoping it's not. I was reading. First of all, you're really a great storyteller. I mean, I couldn't, like, I was just reading, and I knew it's going to be a tragic outcome. I'm hoping, like, maybe somehow magically this will not be a tragic outcome. And I was reading like the text messages between her and her boyfriend, like, for God's sake, just go to the damn emergency room. Like, I mean, it's unimaginable that you feel you're almost, I mean, she's a healthcare professional having symptoms. She knew they could be heart attack, and she still was fearful of going. Like, I don't know what to say. I mean, what was, why didn't she go? Like, what did you uncover? Why didn't she just leave?
yeah. Um, That's the big question, right? Why didn't she go? And that was the whole purpose of the story, was trying to get at why didn't she go when she knew she was having a heart attack. And what those closest to her said was she was working in an environment, in a culture that doesn't let you go. You can't even go to the bathroom. um, you can't eat lunch. What makes you think you can close the whole pharmacy and go to the hospital, especially if maybe it's not a heart attack? And that was clear from her, messages as well. Like the last thing she wrote was, hopefully it's nothing and I'll be back at work. Um,
I mean,
I,
she was afraid that if she goes and it's not a heart attack, she would be penalized, basically. That's what I gathered from the story.
that is what her coworkers and family think was in the back of her mind. And what I hoped through my story to show was that indeed she did work for a company that expects a lot of self-sacrifice. Now, obviously, they don't want anybody to work until they die. And I absolutely believe that. And I had a really good conversation with Michael DeAngelis, who's the vice president of communications for CVS, and what I thought was a candid conversation. And think he I think he feels awful about it. And I don't think that's the outcome anybody wanted. But you've got to step back and recognize the culture that this company and many companies have created in this country, where profitability is more important than anything else. And they can say everything under the sunshine differently. But at the end of the day, that's the culture that they've created. The expectation is that you keep working. It doesn't matter if you're sick. It doesn't matter if you're miscarrying your baby and bleeding on the floor. It doesn't matter if you're vomiting in a trash can behind the pharmacy counter. It doesn't matter if you've got permanent kidney damage because you've held your bladder so long over so many shifts. You keep working and you keep hitting those metrics. And I don't know, nobody was in Ashleigh's mind when she made that decision. So only she knows, and she's gone. But
When you,
that culture, I think, I think it played a role.
yeah.
Certainly everybody around her does.
I mean, culture does play a role. I mean, you kind of know the type of environment and you end up working towards that environment. As you were investigating this, obviously you've talked to other CVS employees. Did they all corroborate the cultural element? Because if they're all corroborating this, so I don't know what DeAngelis he's in denial. I mean, obviously he feels bad because an employee died and all of this, but if every single other pharmacist is saying the same, honestly, I mean, I have no sympathy for him.
Every other pharmacist corroborated.
Yeah, I mean, you've
And I
got
don't think
a,
I would have been interested in the story had I not already established that from my previous reporting.
yeah.
I, I spent so much time talking to pharmacists, hours and hours and hours talking to pharmacists, and almost felt like I was in a therapy session, listening to them talk about the trauma that they experienced from these jobs that just crushed them mentally, physically, and spiritually.
Emily, did you see this across all retail pharmacy? Like how much of this, let's say CVS versus Walgreens versus Target versus Costco, like did you cast a wide net to see how much of this company related versus professional related?
Yeah. And it was pretty consistent across all of the corporately owned pharmacy chains. Um, the the pharmacists who had worked at multiple chains over the course of their careers all told me that of the ones they worked for, CVS was, I don't want to use the word the worst because but the one that exemplified that ethos more than the others. It was the most stressful for them.
But when you talk to DeAngelis and you said, look, I've talked to whatever 50 folks, and this has been saying, like, I'm just trying to think, like, no answer. Like, I mean, nothing saying, well, we're gonna make some changes, we're gonna I don't know.
Sure, there were those types of statements about the recognition of the incredible, amount of pressure that has been on pharmacists, certainly with COVID, that a lot has been asked of them and they've stepped up and they've done a lot. Recognition of this inability to find enough pharmacists and pharmacy technicians to staff the stores to the levels that maybe they need to be staffed. Commitments to make changes and citing changes that have already been made. But I mean, he's a spokesperson for
Right.
a publicly traded company, really beholden to shareholders. I don't know. I've not talked to Mike DeAngelis, the human, right? Like, I've had human conversations with him, but he is,
right.
My conversations with him are as a spokesperson for a company. If you take him away from that role, it might be a very different conversation. I'm cognizant that he is not speaking for himself, but he's speaking for a company. So I don't know really. I can't speak to the man himself or what he thinks. I'm just aware that
the market cap of CVS Pharmacy is $96.6 billion. The share of CVS is $76.84, just for those who are listening. Emily, I mean, how much of this, I mean, look, burnout, I guess metrics, let me step back. Metrics do exist in every profession.
Sure.
Like in journalism, if you probably have no report in a year, like, okay, well, I'm sorry. I mean, I have metrics, you have metrics, all of these things. And to an extent, that's okay, because you need to have some accountability and reliability, and you want to also separate people who work hard versus not. Did you look at the metrics? Did you investigate whether these metrics are even realistic, reasonable metrics that, I don't know, they're good for people, for patients are being served?
I did. And again, like, yes, I acknowledge that these metrics are just a standard way that we all do business, and I've got metrics as well. But I think what I found to be troubling was just the emphasis placed on metrics above all else, and the fact that these metrics didn't seem to be reduced for stores that were clearly understaffed, were clearly struggling, that even corporate knew that these stores don't have enough pharmacists to hit the metrics that are imposed upon them. And yet there doesn't seem to be any real slacking off of those metrics. Like, they're still expected to hit it. And I talked to a lot of pharmacists who are pulling all-nighters, once or twice a week, working until, they're supposed to go home at 10 p.m., but they're staying until 4 a.m. to get caught up, just to get the store back to where it should be. And then they're starting their shift at 8 a.m., on 3 hours of sleep multiple times.
And obviously this could lead to errors. I could tell you that I was bringing medication for my dad the other day, and there was an error in the directions. And had I not been a physician and knew exactly that was an error, I could imagine that others would have had an issue. And I could really appreciate the fact that burnout and overwork could lead to errors. Is this something you would investigate outside of pharmacy, nursing, physicians, other specialists? Because I think I disagree when people say burnout doesn't exist. I think it does exist. I think our job to know how much of the burnout is exaggerated versus the real thing. Your story was an eye opener to me into a sector of pharmacy that I didn't realize how burnt out pharmacists are. I really did not know. And I bet you a lot of people did not know that this is how much they are overworked. So my two questions, number one, are you looking outside of pharmacy into other healthcare sectors? And number two, when you spoke to these folks, were there any solutions offered? Okay, we've got a problem. Do we have any solutions?
So on the first part of the question, I'm not actively looking outside of pharmacy right now, although I have received emails and phone calls from people outside of pharmacy letting me know that this is not unique to pharmacy, that this is happening in every industry where profits are really more important than people. A lot of private equity owned firms, and just like any time that you've reduced operations to numbers and not people, I think a lot of people are feeling squeezed and burnt out. Lots of nurses have contacted me, in fact. But I feel like it's very hard for me to widen my lens because investigations are often more powerful if you go narrow, but very, very deep versus broad,
I
because
agree.
then you can't go very deep. Now you're shallow but broad. Now you're just sort of making sweeping generalizations, even though I believe that those are probably true right now. So, but not that I wouldn't be open to doing a targeted investigation in other industries, because I do think this is prevalent. And then on the second part of the question, the solution. So a lot of people have told me that these PBMs, the pharmacy benefits managers, are really the root of what's happening right now. These third-party administrators of prescription drug plans have so tilted the scales in their favor in terms of how they're reimbursing pharmacies for prescription medicine, that pharmacists are just barely able to make a profit. And it's even worse for independent pharmacies that don't have the negotiating power of these big chains. Their reimbursements for medications are even less than what CVS and Walgreens and Walmart are getting. And so there are a lot of independent pharmacies closing. In fact, this year is an especially bad one for them. But so I'm looking at PBMs and the lack of sensible regulation over their practices, because they really seem to be affecting retail pharmacy and putting the lives of pharmacists and patients at risk.
Did you sense from the pharmacists that you've interviewed that a lot of the burnout that they are experiencing was directly related because of COVID and the pandemic? Or, in other words, were they actually having these issues before the pandemic?
What they told me was that these issues were already very prevalent prior to the pandemic, and that the pandemic just exacerbated them to, like, they were at a 7 and then they went to a 10 with the pandemic. So these issues really, according to literally everybody I interviewed who'd been in the industry for for more than a decade or so, everybody told me it was somewhere between 2010 and 2013, 14 is when the industry really started changing, and staffing was just being steadily decreased, and more demands were placed upon them. And they were already filing complaints and with their boards of pharmacy. There were already many state workforce surveys in which pharmacists were reporting stress and burnout to just like unimaginable degrees before the pandemic. The pandemic just set it all on fire.
Did you look into, is there shortage of pharmacists in the United States? Like, I mean, per capita, I mean, do we have enough pharmacists? Is this because there's supply demand issue? It's just supply demand?
That's actually like a controversial question. So there, according to the corporate offices, there is a shortage of pharmacists. They're really struggling to hire enough. And this is sort of amid a shortage of healthcare workers overall. If you look at the numbers, there are about the same number of pharmacists, although we probably eventually will start seeing some pretty sharp declines because there's been a decline in the number of people going to pharmacy school. But the number of pharmacists is relatively stable. It's just that most of them are trying not to go into retail pharmacy or are leaving retail pharmacy, and then they're going into other areas, such as like inpatient hospital pharmacists, clinical pharmacists, pharmacists who are working for other entities, like managing a caseload of patients to make sure that they're, on top of their blood pressure medication or what have you.
I mean, I would love for you, not giving you more work, but I think since you're really focusing on this, I think looking into hospital pharmacy and other, like looking at the profession and outside of retail is also important. It makes me wonder whether also inpatient hospital pharmacists are experiencing similar burnout. I don't know.
Yeah, so I've talked to a few of them, and some of them certainly are, but the vast majority of them are telling me that, especially those who worked in retail and then have been able to make that switch, that it's a night and day experience for them.
Wow. Is there a significant pay discrepancy? Like the retail pharmacists, do they make way more than inpatient or hospital? So that's why they are willing, I guess, to burn out and sacrifice because they're getting a fatter paycheck?
I don't know. I have not actually looked at the salary scale for different types of pharmacists. I know that a lot of retail pharmacists have told me it's hard for them to make the transition because a lot of the hospitals want pharmacists who have gone through like these clinical internships, and specific things that they would have had to done in like had to do in college or shortly after college, and that if you spent a certain amount of time in retail, you're just not going to have those types of qualifications. And so making that transition is pretty hard. And then also a lot of these people who've worked for a certain chain for a number of years, right? They've accrued, like stock options, and they're vested, or they're just 5 years away from retirement. So you've got a whole host of them just feeling as though they're unable to make that transition. Most chain pharmacists would love to go to independent pharmacies, but those are closing left and right too. So I think they're just really in a bind. And then the other thing is that most pharmacists I've talked to went into retail because they really like working directly with patients. And so, some of the clinical stuff, I don't know that I'm sure they'll correct me if I'm wrong, get the same level of interaction with patients in other areas of pharmacy.
I mean, look, in my local pharmacy here in my neighborhood, which we use, I literally have it to a system when to go. I actually go to pick up medications like after 10 or 11 p.m. or very early in the morning, because during the day, I will have to wait 30 to 45 minutes to pick even one or two prescriptions. And I would be angry and upset waiting in line, but then I look behind the counter and they're working. Like, it's not like, they're actually sitting down and they're not working. And I kind of feel bad. I'm like, I can't be angry because they're really running around and on the phone and everything. And I just told you, like, there was an error in one of the prescriptions prescribed, which is like it's a cardiac medication. So it's actually a big deal. So I'm really very sympathetic. I'm just really struggling what the next steps are. Can you help us? Like, what are your thoughts? What did you learn from this tragic story that put me to tears last night? I was reading it.
I think there are a lot of things that need to happen. There needs to be sensible regulation of pharmacy benefits managers and more light shown upon the contracts that they have, I was going to say negotiated, but from the sounds of it, they don't really do much negotiation. They sort of, it's a take it or leave it plan. And so I think lawmakers across the country and on the national level really need to dig into how these PBMs operate and see if they can level the playing field a little bit. Secondly, these boards of pharmacy in every state, you're starting to see some, like in Ohio, for example, really stand up to the way these chains are operating and cracking down on some of the unsafe practices, like understaffing these stores and this just obscene adherence to the metrics at the cost of all else. So you're
Right.
seeing Ohio, California, Oklahoma. I think more state boards of pharmacies really need to get active in how these places are operating and set some ground rules too. I think those are the two main options. It'd be nice to say, I wish the chains would just fully staff these pharmacies and adjust the metrics to a more reasonable level. I think they've known that, they've heard that for years. I don't know if they're going to do that.
Did you sense from talking to Ashleigh Anderson's family that they are contemplating any litigation?
I don't know. I wouldn't be able to answer
Right.
that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think in your article you mentioned that CVS did contribute to a fund, $10,000 or something like that, and the family was very unhappy with that. But as I was reading it, I was trying to think it must have crossed their mind, and probably somebody would say, well, they told her to go and she did not go. I mean, it's not really, there's nothing, we can't really force her to go. It's very difficult to prove the link of the culture issue and the work environment directly linked to that with her.
Yeah. I mean, I do know that they're really their main concern at this point. I don't think they're interested in money for themselves. I know that they were
Right.
really hoping that CVS would contribute um, to create a sustainable scholarship in their daughter's name so that every year they would be able to um, award a scholarship to a recipient and keep their daughter's memory alive. I think that's their primary concern, is just, make sure their daughter isn't forgotten and that she didn't die in vain, and that other pharmacists might be able to learn from it.
Such a tragedy. I mean, a young life, very just lost because of this. Emily, are there any other thoughts, any last thoughts you would like to leave viewers and listeners with? I'm very grateful for your time, and as I told you, you put me to tears last night reading this, because you have a way of delivering the information where I was reading very sad story, and I was hoping it's fiction, but it wasn't fiction.
Yeah, I felt the same way. Um, I felt very connected to Ashley. I think anybody who, everybody in this country especially is so tied to their careers, right? Like your profession kind of becomes your identity, and your self-worth is really wrapped up in your productivity. And it's hard to disconnect from that sometimes. And so I felt, I just saw a lot of myself in Ashley. And maybe that would be my last thought, is no matter where you work or whatever your profession is, just to remember that you are not your job, and your productivity is not a determination of your self-worth, and to just spend more time with your family and take care of yourself, because at the end of the day, your job could get rid of you at any time. Your real
Yeah,
allegiance is to yourself.
I um, I was really touched by the billboard that the family bought time to actually put this, like, your job can wait, your heart can't. I mean, this is just like I felt somebody got in my chest and ripped my heart out, and it's just unbelievable.
Yeah. Her
And
parents are so amazing, just the kindest people.
then you had a picture of her family around her grave. It's really I hope everybody reads this story and learn about it. I just hope that CVS and other retail pharmacies are really going to be responsive to this. We do not want to lose more lives because of this. This is just not the way it should go.
I agree. So glad that you thought to reach out and that you're interested in this. Thank you so much.
No, no, thank you. Emily Le Coz on Healthcare Unfiltered. Really very appreciative of your time, of your dedication. Look forward to reading more stories, and hopefully more stories will lead to better solutions. I mean, unless we shed more light on these things will continue as is. And I think our job is to continue to educate the public and make sure people are aware of the problems, and hopefully this leads to solutions.
Hope so too. Thank you so much.